My wife said I'd never be enough and left. Now she's crying in court because I'm marrying her sister. I'm a 33-year-old man, and this morning I watched my ex-wife put her face in her hands and sob in a courtroom because I filed to marry her younger sister. If you think that sentence makes me the villain, you're not alone. Most days I still wake up with my stomach flipped, wondering how I became the guy people whisper about at the bakery. But if I tell it from the beginning, maybe it'll make sense, or at least explain how a quiet, boring man like me ended up here. Her name is Laura. We met at a friend's housewarming 8 years ago. She had that kind of presence that bends a room, bright laugh, straight posture, the look like she'd already decided who everyone was and where they fit. I fit, in her eyes, as dependable. Solid. Steady hands, she once said, after I fixed the loose hinge on her kitchen cabinet with a butter knife. She liked that I didn't add noise to her life. It took me too long to realize she also liked that I didn't add resistance. Our first years together were simple in a way that made me grateful. Shared playlists, a tiny apartment that always smelled like coffee, plans made on Sunday nights with a pen and a magnetic board. I thought we were building the same life. Then, at some point I can't pin down, she started talking about what-ifs. What if we lived closer to the city center? What if we traveled more? What if I changed jobs because my salary capped our momentum? I listened. I tried. I asked for a raise and got one. We moved to a slightly bigger place. We took a budget trip to Lisbon. The bar kept moving. The first real crack showed up in the way she graded every interaction like a schoolteacher. I'd come home with groceries and she'd point out the wrong brand of pasta. I'd suggest dinner with my parents and she'd roll her eyes. If I tried to sit next to her on the couch, she'd lean forward and say she had emails to finish. She started praising other people in comparison to me, a colleague who knew how to negotiate, a friend who just exudes vision. I thought it was just a season of restlessness. I told myself love would outlast tone. Then came the night that rewired me. I'd made a stupid mistake with our finances. I accepted a bad promo deal at work that came with a bonus but no long-term growth. I didn't see the trap, and a month later I had to admit I'd been short-sighted. I sat across from her at our kitchen table and told her everything. She didn't shout. She didn't even look angry. She just stared, like she'd been holding a card close to her chest and finally had her excuse to play it. She told me she'd been thinking a lot about our marriage. She told me she felt compressed by my habits and my pace. And then she dropped the phrase that still hums in my ears, that I'd never be enough. Not mean, not hysterical, more like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. There's a particular kind of silence that follows that kind of sentence. You can't fight it without instantly becoming defensive, you can't accept it without agreeing to be less than human. I tried to ask what enough meant. She said she craved a life with urgency. She said she wanted a partner who pushed, who took her places. She whispered this as if she was confiding something heartbreaking, as if telling me my limits was an act of mercy. She left 3 weeks later. Not with a slam, not with a suitcase thrown down the stairs. She scheduled a moving van, labeled her boxes, and thanked me for making it so respectful. Friends took turns picking sides. Mine offered beer. Hers offered new beginnings. She told her family in a tone I couldn't read, and I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the man who tried to recruit allies. Her mother, Helen, sent me a text full of sorrow and the kindest kind of distance. Her father, Peter, asked me if I needed help with furniture I no longer had. And her younger sister, Emily, didn't text at all. I barely knew Emily back then beyond holiday dinners. She was the quiet one, soft sweaters, notebooks, that way of looking at people's mouths when they spoke like she was measuring the space between words. At Christmas she'd be the one clearing plates before anyone asked. At birthdays she'd sit on the floor with the dog. She and Laura were different kinds of bright, Laura like a marquee, Emily like a pilot light. I used to think the house was built around Laura. Now I think the house survived because of Emily. I didn't see Emily until 2 months after the separation, at Helen's birthday. Yes, I went. It was a dumb decision if you only value self-preservation. But I'd stayed close to her parents, and that family had been my family. I brought flowers and convinced myself I could stand in a room with my ex-wife without breaking into pieces. Laura arrived late, in a dress that told a story about how well she was doing. People ask if I saw jealousy in her, if I'd started dating. I hadn't. All I saw was relief in her posture, like she'd cut a rope and finally stopped dragging something heavy. The first surprise of that night wasn't Laura. It was the cake. Helen made a joke about forgetting the candles and then burst into tears. Everyone rushed to her, and she apologized, saying that ever since her own mother died she'd found herself crying at random. I put a hand on her shoulder and tried to help. Emily went to the kitchen and, within 3 minutes, returned with a tray of lit tea lights stuck in strawberries. The room exhaled. Helen laughed through tears and I saw something I hadn't noticed before, the way Emily always moved toward problems without announcing it. When I left, Emily followed me onto the porch. She handed me a paper bag I'd left behind in the kitchen, a tiny thing, and said I looked thin. I made a crack about learning to cook for one. She didn't laugh. She told me she'd wanted to call but chose not to out of respect for Laura. Then she said something I didn't expect, that Laura's sentence about me, that never be enough, had sounded rehearsed, like something she'd practiced saying to herself in the mirror until it fit. Emily said she didn't agree with it. She said I was, at worst, ordinary, and ordinary was a relief. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I started texting. At first it was logistical, Helen's blood pressure, Peter's car trouble, a list of tools he needed me to borrow. Then it drifted. She told me she was designing a small line of stationery, trying to sell it online. I told her about the plant I kept killing on my windowsill. She sent a photo of a notebook she'd hand-stitched with blue thread. I sent a photo of pasta I'd scorched on the bottom but ate anyway. There was nothing flirtatious about it, or at least, I didn't let it be. I didn't say anything I couldn't say in front of a crowd, but a shape began to form in the space where my marriage had collapsed, a shape made of small, intact kindnesses. Then, a second crack I didn't see coming. Peter called me late one night, voice thin, asking if I could come by. He'd found something troubling in a folder on his desk. When I arrived, he handed me a stack of papers. They were bank statements for an account I didn't recognize, dated from the last year of my marriage. Several transfers from our joint savings, small ones, spaced out, then a couple larger ones near the end. My name was on the transfer authorizations, except I hadn't made them. It took me a second to realize I was looking at my own signature. Or rather, a very close imitation. The curve of the J in my name was slightly too smooth, the tail of the L tilted the wrong way. Peter looked at me like a man who didn't want to see what he was seeing. He said the account belonged to Laura. He said he only noticed because he and Helen were reorganizing finances after a spike in household costs. He apologized for even asking, then asked if I had any explanation. I sat there with my ears buzzing. I remembered a dozen small moments that suddenly clicked into a pattern, the way Laura insisted on handling bills during the months we were reprioritizing, the way she'd made a point of telling me she was taking the mental load. I realized the insult, that I'd never be enough, had been thrown like smoke in the room before someone slips out the back door. I didn't want to turn this into a war. I also didn't want to rewrite history with a martyr pen. I told Peter I hadn't made those transfers. He believed me. Or wanted to. He squeezed my shoulder the way my own dad does when he's trying not to cry. We decided, together, not to blow up. Peter said he'd talk to Laura privately, and I asked him not to mention my involvement. The next day, Emily texted me to ask if I was okay. I hadn't told her anything. She said I'd looked like I was carrying something heavy. I told her it was complicated and that I didn't want to set fire to the family. She replied that fires don't start with truth, they start with gasoline. And then she wrote that truth sometimes hurts like disinfectant, it stings, but it's the only way the wound doesn't rot. Within a week, another shock. Helen invited me over, alone. She said she wanted me to take a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother, for safekeeping, until the family settled. It felt like a strange errand. When I opened it at home, I found a neat stack of letters tied with ribbon. On top, an envelope with my name in Helen's handwriting. She wrote that she was ashamed she hadn't seen what was happening, not only with the money, but with the way Laura had learned to position people like furniture. She wrote about her own guilt, about the messages she'd sent her daughters without meaning to, about praising the loud achievements and treating the quiet ones like wallpaper. At the bottom she added something that made my hands shake, that if I ever found myself accused of not being enough, I should remember who said it and why. The box also contained a letter addressed to Emily, not from Helen, but from their grandmother. It was dated years earlier, written when the old woman knew she was dying. I didn't open it. I called Helen and told her she'd given me the wrong box. She said no, she meant it. She wanted me to hand Emily her letter because, in her words, she listens when you speak. I gave Emily the letter in the park, by the bench near the duck pond where we met sometimes with takeaway coffees. She read silently. I watched the color move in her face, not sure if I should stand or step away. When she finished, she folded it with those careful hands and told me her grandmother had left a small cottage in her name, a place by the coast the family used to visit. She'd always assumed Laura would get it because Laura had a way of arriving first to things. But the letter explained the choice and asked Emily to be brave and private about it, to keep the place safe from the kind of energy that turns a home into a showroom. Emily had never told anyone because she didn't want a war. And then she looked at me and said she now thought maybe silence had been the wrong kind of peace. I asked why she was telling me. She said because the same pattern that had pushed me out of my own marriage had pushed her out of rooms in her own family. She said she didn't want to act alone anymore. She wanted to claim something without apologizing first. Weeks turned into months. Laura and I finalized the divorce. It was strangely clean. No children, no real estate, only the question of whether those transfers needed to come back. Helen quietly made that right without letting it become public. In those months, Emily and I were careful. We didn't cross lines. We didn't sneak. We met with Helen sometimes, all three of us, to help Peter through a knee surgery. The shape between me and Emily kept forming, and even if I refused to name it, I could feel it there whenever her phone lit up with my name. The day it changed was the day we drove to the cottage. Emily asked me to come see it, to help her take stock of what it would need to be livable again. The place was more beautiful than any of my memories from childhood trips to the sea, salt-softened wood, a narrow path of crushed shells, windows that faced the horizon like they'd been positioned for watching storms. We spent the afternoon sweeping, pulling up weeds, opening stuck drawers. We ate sandwiches on the step, quiet in the way you are when your body wants to say more than your mouth can. As the sun dropped, Emily told me she didn't want to repeat her sister's life. She didn't want to swallow her needs or weaponize them. She said she'd thought long and hard about whether the feeling she had for me was real or just a reaction to family chaos. She said it felt like standing in her own kitchen and choosing her own cup. She said she didn't expect me to return anything. I told her I did. I told her I'd been trying not to name it for too long. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hold hands. We just sat with the truth and let it be heavy and clean. When we told Helen and Peter, they were quiet, and then they were relieved, which surprised me. Peter said he'd been waiting for one of his daughters to choose kindness as a compass. Helen cried again, but this time the tears had laughter mixed in. The only person we hadn't told was Laura. We agreed she deserved to hear it from us, not through some post or a cousin's message. Emily asked for time. She wanted to gather courage and choose a setting where Laura wouldn't feel ambushed. Before we could do that, rumors grew legs. Someone saw us carrying paint into the cottage and decided that meant we were living together. Someone saw us at the market and decided we were engaged. By the time Laura called Emily, the story had been told a dozen ways. She didn't ask questions. She delivered a verdict. She said Emily had betrayed her. She said I had proven who I was. She said if we had any decency we'd move to another city. Emily told her she loved her but wouldn't apologize for loving someone who treated her well. Laura hung up. I wished the story ended with a quiet spring wedding by the sea. Instead, Laura filed a formal objection with the county when we submitted our notice of intent to marry. I didn't know you could object to a marriage license without citing something legal like bigamy. Apparently, you can file a statement and force a short hearing to ensure free consent. She claimed I'd manipulated Emily while our divorce was pending, that I'd infiltrated her family, that everything from the cottage to the bank transfers was some long con. The words were wild. The sting was real. Emily's hands shook when she read it. Peter's mouth turned into a straight line I'd never seen on him. Helen looked smaller than she had all year. We didn't want a drawn-out battle. We gathered what was simple: dates, messages, the divorce decree, the timeline of the cottage letter. We agreed not to attack Laura in public. We would show up, speak plainly, and let the facts sit between us. I didn't sleep for 2 nights. I kept hearing the old sentence, that I'd never be enough, bouncing around in my skull like a coin in a dryer. This morning, in a room with gray carpet and a humming light, a clerk called our names. Laura stood on the other side, arms crossed, and for the first time since she left me I saw uncertainty in her posture. The clerk asked simple questions. Emily answered with a voice that shook at first and then steadied. I read a short statement about the timeline. Helen, against her own instinct to avoid scenes, handed over a copy of her mother's letter to Emily, the one about the cottage, and a note stating she, not I, had addressed the issue of the missing money privately months ago. When Laura began to speak, the clerk slowed her with a raised palm and reminded her this wasn't a trial. Laura's voice cracked. Then broke. She covered her face and cried, loud, messy, old child kind of crying that hits from the gut. I wanted to reach for her. Not to fix it, not to erase what she'd done to me, just because seeing someone you once loved collapse is a reflex you can't unlearn. Emily touched my wrist and shook her head lightly. Not out of hardness. Out of respect for the boundaries we'd promised each other we'd keep. The clerk said he'd take the documents, review them, and issue a decision within the week. When we walked out into the corridor, my legs felt like sand. Laura sat on a wooden bench and stared at the floor. I waited for her to look up. She didn't. Emily squeezed my hand once and let go. We kept walking. The doors opened. The cold air hit my face in a way that reminded me of the coast. I don't know how to be the man who is both gentle and firm. I only know I'm trying. And that's where we are now, holding our breath, waiting for a stamp on a page that shouldn't have needed defending. The clerk's decision arrived 3 days later in a thin envelope that made my hands shake before I even opened it. It was concise: the objection was dismissed, the county would issue our license, no evidence of coercion or impediment had been found. It was the opposite of dramatic. A stamp. 2 sentences. A door unlatched with a soft click. I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice, then once aloud to make sure the words were real. Emily listened, leaned her forehead against my shoulder, and let out a breath that seemed to have been living inside her ribs for months. Relief didn't erase the mess. It just gave us permission to move through it. Within hours, my phone lit up with messages from numbers I didn't know well. A cousin of Laura's accused me of stealing a sister like furniture. An old friend sent a cautious thumbs up and then deleted it, as if support might be punishable by social tax. My own parents, who had stayed painfully neutral since the separation, asked if we were rushing into something. I told them it didn't feel like rushing because we'd been walking the long way around for a year. Emily asked to tell Laura in person about the decision, not so much because it was required but because she wanted to avoid the feeling of a victory lap. She picked a cafe near Laura's office, neutral ground, bright windows, too public for a scene. I offered to go. She said she needed to do this alone. She wore a simple sweater and tied her hair back the way she does when she wants to keep her head clear. I watched her walk away and realized that a big part of loving her was learning when not to follow. She came back an hour later with tears dried at the edges of her eyelashes. Laura had sat down, ordered nothing, and asked one question: if this was really happening. Emily said yes. Laura replied with a list of reasons it couldn't, that it would fracture the family, that people would call her names, that every holiday would feel like a referendum. Emily said she understood. Laura asked if we'd planned this while we were still married. Emily told her no, and set the timeline down like tiles. Laura said timelines are just drawings people make to feel moral. Emily said she loved her and that she wouldn't debate her like a stranger on the internet. Laura left without touching her cup. In the reflection of the cafe window, Emily had watched her own face hold steady and felt, for once, like it belonged to her. If there's a villain at this point, it's not Laura, even if part of me wants it to be. It's the story Laura learned to tell herself and everyone else. The story where love is proof of status and, enough, is a moving target. The story where a person's value is measured in spectacle. I know because I lived inside that story and tried to furnish it with quiet dinners and steady calendars. The other villain is the part of me that still wants to be praised for being the good one. That's a trap too. Goodness isn't a mirror we hold up to make someone else look worse. It's a decision we make when no one's clapping. We decided to marry at the cottage. Not a big party, just family who wanted to stand with us, a few friends who had stayed when the air got thin, and a simple meal. We asked Peter to say a few words because he's a man of few words and we trust the ones he chooses. We told Helen she could wear whatever she wanted and that we didn't need matching anything. Emily designed the invitations herself, handmade cards with a small embossed shoreline. I kept mine on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tomato. In the weeks leading to the day, two things happened that turned my understanding again. The first came from Helen. She asked me to help sort old boxes in their attic. She said she was looking for winter blankets and that Peter shouldn't be lifting the heavier ones with his knees still healing. Attics are museums of indecision, things too loved to throw away, too painful to display. We found an old suitcase with a broken clasp, and inside it a set of journals bound with ribbon. They were Laura's, from late high school through college. Helen hesitated and then closed the lid. I told her we should leave them. She said she needed to see, not to pry, but because she had missed too much already by refusing to look. She opened one. The handwriting was sharp, impatient. On a page near the end, a line caught both our eyes. Laura had written that she hated the way ordinary days made her feel, like an understudy in a life that should have been mine. Under it, a list of things she would never be: stuck, stagnant, safe. Next to safe, a tiny arrow pointing to the word trap. Helen closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. She said she remembered praising Laura for being driven, without also teaching her to be gentle. She said she'd treated Emily's quiet like a resource to be used, the extra pair of hands, the person who would drive everyone home. She cried, not to be forgiven but because regret is heavy. She asked me if she should talk to Laura about the journals. I said it might do more harm than good. She nodded and put them back. Not everything needs to be an exhibit. The second thing came from Laura herself. She asked to meet me. I almost said no. Emily told me I could say yes as long as I promised to be clear and brief. We sat on a bench near the river where we used to walk on Sundays. Laura looked tired in a way I didn't recognize, like the kind of tired that comes after the adrenaline of reinvention wears off. She didn't bring accusations. She brought a confession, and it wasn't the one I expected. She said that after she left me, the first weeks were euphoric in the way any escape feels euphoric. She said she drank the attention like water. She said every new restaurant, every new face, felt like proof she'd done the right thing. Then, about 4 months in, a quiet started to creep in at the edges. Not loneliness, that she could fight with noise, but the slow realization that the person she was running from came with her. She told me she wished she'd said I wasn't the right person for the life she wanted, instead of telling me I'd never be enough. She said she'd chosen cruel precision because it absolved her of having to wrestle with doubt. She said she filed the objection not because she thought she could stop the marriage, but because the idea of me standing next to Emily made her feel replaced in a way she hadn't prepared for. She asked if we had already set a date. I told her yes. She asked where. I told her the cottage. She nodded and said of course. She didn't ask for an invitation. I didn't offer one. It wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was a clean blue that felt like a favor. Emily wore a simple dress that looked like it had been made from light. I put on a suit that made me look more serious than I feel most days. Peter, on a wooden chair by the door, held a piece of paper he never used. He said his words without reading, that love is not a ladder, it's a table. That you don't climb it to be seen, you sit at it to be fed. That he had failed in small ways and was trying now to make it up by being present. We kept the ceremony short. We spoke vows we'd written in a shared notebook, lines about patience, about not moving the goalposts without naming it, about telling the truth even when it scrapes. Helen handed us 2 rings she'd found in a drawer, simple bands that had belonged to her parents. We exchanged them with hands that didn't tremble. Someone popped a bottle of sparkling apple juice, and someone else laughed too loudly, and the dog barked at a gull. Ordinary things. Good things. At the edge of the property, near the dune grass, I saw a figure. For a second I thought my eyes had made it, the way you imagine ghosts of old choices. It was Laura. She stood far enough away to make leaving easy. Emily saw her too and looked at me. I walked a few steps, not to invite her in, but to acknowledge the history. She lifted a hand half an inch and let it fall. Her face was unreadable, a mix of pride and sorrow and something else I couldn't name. Then she turned and walked back toward the road. It wasn't a scene. It was a sentence finishing itself. The weeks after the wedding were practical in a way that grounded me. We painted the kitchen. We moved our 2 small lives into one set of drawers. We learned the choreography of mornings, how Emily likes the kettle to sing before she pours, how I put my keys in different places when I'm tired. We drove into town to buy a lamp and ended up arguing in the aisle about whether it was too bright. We laughed halfway through and bought it anyway. I went back to work and found that typing my normal emails felt like coming back from sea legs to dry ground. Not everyone came back around. A few people decided our story threatened theirs and moved us into the category of those you don't mention at dinners. I learned not to take inventory. You can lose years making spreadsheets of who stayed and who left. The ones who mattered stayed. My sister, Hannah, who told me she'd never liked how Laura looked at me like a project. My friend Mark, who said he'd hold me accountable if I ever started telling the good guy version of the story. Helen and Peter, who bring soup when it rains. And Emily, always Emily, who folds receipts into tiny squares before throwing them away. What about the money, the forged signature, the parts of the story that still stink when I open certain drawers? Helen repaid me quietly and asked me never to use it as currency in a fight. I put the refund into a savings account for the roof we'll eventually need to fix. It's not forgiveness, exactly. It's choosing not to keep a ledger as a weapon. I don't think Laura stole because she's evil. I think she took because the life she wanted cost more than the one we had, and she decided she was owed interest. That doesn't make it right. It just explains how people cut corners when they've convinced themselves the destination justifies all routes. Sometimes, late at night, when the house creaks and the sea sounds like someone breathing in the next room, doubt walks through the door I forgot to lock. It asks me if I've built my second life on top of the ruins of someone else's. It shows me images of future Christmases with one sister at the table and one not. It reminds me that stories don't end with a certificate or a cake, they end in 1,000 tiny choices that either keep rooms warm or slowly let in drafts. When doubt comes, I don't argue with it the way I used to. I make tea. I sit by the window. I think about the sentence that hurt me, that I'd never be enough, and I turn it over like a coin you've been told is counterfeit. It isn't a truth. It's a spell. Spells break when you say them out loud and then put them down. Last week, I saw Laura again by accident at the supermarket. We both reached for the same jar of pasta sauce and laughed in that awkward way you do when your muscles remember how to be polite. She asked if the cottage felt like home. I said yes. She asked if Emily was happy. I said yes, and meant it in a way that felt like permission rather than a performance. She nodded and told me she'd started seeing a therapist who had told her that ambition isn't a map, it's a tool, and that she'd been using it like armor. She said she didn't expect my forgiveness and that she wasn't asking for it. She said she hoped I'd be brave enough to be ordinary. I told her I'd try. We parted next to a pyramid of oranges like people who once were each other's future and now are just citizens of the same town. If you're reading this because you love scandal, I'm not giving you what you want. There's no revenge beyond choosing a life that doesn't run on applause. There's no gotcha beyond the fact that the person who told me I'd never be enough cried in a room full of strangers because I found a place where enough isn't a verdict, it's a daily bread. If you're reading this because you've been told you're too small for someone else's dreams, I don't have big advice. I have small advice. Make breakfast. Sweep a floor. Tell the truth a day earlier than you want to. And when someone moves the goalposts, name it out loud. Do I regret marrying my ex-wife's sister? No. Regret feels like the wrong word for a choice that has brought steady warmth into my days. Do I grieve the old life? Yes, sometimes, in the way you grieve a city you moved away from. You remember the streets you walked, not the way they tilted when it rained. You forget the noise until you visit. Then you remember why you left. Tonight Emily fell asleep on the couch with a book face down on her chest. I turned off the lamp that is still slightly too bright and tucked a blanket around her. The house clicked and sighed like it was also settling. I washed 2 mugs and put them on the rack to dry. I'm not the hero of this story. I'm just a man trying to build something that doesn't require anybody to perform to belong. And on quiet nights like this, when the water hits the rocks and the horizon folds into the dark, I wonder if I've finally learned how to hold what I have without bracing for it to be taken. I want to believe I have. But the truth is, I still don't know if I'm doing any of this right, and I'm a little scared to admit that out loud. I don't know what to do.
Follow me for more stories.